I'm okay. I am delighted to be here and so many familiar faces. I'm a professor in the School of Architecture. I'm an architect and an activist, and I'm thrilled to have Shoshanna Ehrlich with me, who is a collaborator. She's a lawyer. She's a women and gender studies scholar and has written numerous books on issues in and around abortion access. And we've been collaborating on a number of things, which we will talk about in a little bit. But I also want to say this is in conjunction with an exhibit that I'm a co-curator on that's currently up until October 31st. Now What? Advocacy, Activism and Alliances in American Architecture since 1968. So I'm a co-curator with Sarah Rapison, Andrea Merritt, and Roberta Washington, and it's looking at the very expansive ways architects have been engaged in issues around politics and the built environment for many, many years. And it's in many ways a kind of an unwritten history. So once this closes, we're going to transition into producing a book for this so that this history will be something that people will have access to. So with that being said, a part of the exhibit does mention the work I've been doing on reproductive health care access. So we, in relationship with Maya, had suggested that we hold a panel given what's been happening since the overturn of Dobbs. And both of us, Shoshanna and I, have been quite busy since the overturn of Dobbs and giving various talks to different audiences. So we thought this would be a great way, and as the exhibition is coming to a close, that we do this here. So with that, I'm going to give a framework of the kind of work that I've been researching and involved in around reproductive health care access in North America. And then Shoshanna will talk about some other elements that are, I guess, more directly related to the Dobbs decision and then moving forward. So with that, I will get started. So the impetus of this body of research, which I actually did not think would need to continue after the book was published in 2013, was it came from my frustration with what I continue to perceive as our discipline's lack of political engagement. So I thought, as an architect, if I start to examine spaces that are inherently politicized, how could I bring a different viewpoint to them, and how could that in turn start to push the discipline to hopefully become a bit more engaged and responsive. So this book was the culmination of about 6 years off and on research, traveling around the country, interviewing independent providers to understand what is happening on the ground and how laws and policies are directly impacting physical access. So the book was seeking to make explicit political, cultural, and social influences. Where or can spatial agency be located, and how can our architectural thinking bring new insights into these subjects? So I want to begin with a short film clip from 2012 outside of a clinic in Louisville, Kentucky, to really demonstrates the kind of this peril, but also anxiety producing spaces in the public realm outside of clinics.
Basically, over 90% of women that exterminate their children are doing it out of convenience. Please today repent and turn to Christ. It's so important. Again, as I said,
we're getting all these perverts.
Let me clarify again. Mothers,
you don't come out of the woodwork.
So this is something that happens on a regular basis, not only at this clinic, but many clinics across the country. And what you're seeing is, due to parking being located over a block away, patients and their friends and support systems are required or forced to walk along this sidewalk in order to get to the front door, which is basically kind of where I'm sitting. And they have escorts, the ones in the orange vest, not the green vest, that will guide them towards the door. And so there'll be protesters lined up on this block on a regular basis. So originally, I was very interested, or one of the initial forays into this was around public space and the right to protest guaranteed by our First Amendment. Of course, believe very fervently that people should have the right to protest. But I also believe quite fervently that that protest should not impede their ability to physically access a clinic. So for me, what became the crux of this is how does the kind of ideal of our Constitution and the amendments impact actual and real space on the ground? So there's the legal framework that our country exists within, but then how does that actually start to matter in real space? So this was a kind of very beginning entrance into thinking about this. And I was also, this allowed me to think about how polarizing abortion is in various parts of North America and elsewhere around the world. It remains a platform to think through complex relationships of space, a person's body, varying degrees of what was federal and now state control, the fluid and ever-shifting terrain of reproductive health care access, and the potentials of design thinking to transform spatial relationships and to radically rethink and find agency within them. So part of this research really builds upon our skill set as architects, looking at mapping and visualization techniques. So for example, and these are not up to date, these are at the point of publication, but it provides a snapshot in time. So this shows the gray areas or metropolitan spaces of 50,000 people or more in the US where there is a clinic. And then the white, which is over 89% of the counties in the country have no access to a provider. And this is now even more extreme given that certain states, 13 states is completely illegal. So I do need to update this to reflect that reality. So the visualization became really important because so much of this is textual, but when you start to see it visually, it really becomes, I think, pretty startling how little, even in 2013, there was access in the country. And another thing, as I started to look kind of zoomed out, it required I zoom in because wanted to understand, okay, we've got the scale of the nation, but when we start to look at the scale of the states have different restrictions, which are called or referred to as trap laws, the targeted regulation of abortion providers. And why these are important to understand is that, as you know, many of you are practicing architects in this room or online, that of course we have codes that help create health and safety standards for the built environment. But what was happening and continues to happen with these trap laws is that they are specifically targeted at clinics to make their space have tighter regulations than others. So abortion is one of the safest procedures anyone can have. So, there could be more extreme things happening in a general practitioner's office, in a dermatology office, in a dental office, but those types of medical practitioners are not held to these standards. So these become sometimes really difficult to actually change and renovate to uphold. So by looking at this, I wanted to understand, well, what are they? And I'll highlight just a few for you to get a sense. So like on number 18, certain states will prohibit public facilities from being spaces that can provide abortions. There's been in number 29, building codes were being changed from medical facility, like I just mentioned, to ambulatory surgical center facility, which is, it closed over half the clinics in Texas as an example, because to move walls, doors is a very expensive thing, which may be look on paper to be quite banal, but as you know, it can cost sometimes millions of dollars to renovate to meet these standards. There's also, some states require only physicians to provide the procedure. So it's a wide kind of range of types of laws that are restrictive. So I mapped that across the US because I wanted to understand and visualize, so where are these restrictions? You'll see that every state has some, and some states have a lot more than others. So it shows that no state is free of any of restrictions. Another part of this was wanting to understand, so as a wannabe lawyer, how does law impact the spaces that as architects we have to design and respond to? And I'll give you one example, which is Colorado versus Hill. This was a case that began in the Denver Boulder City Council in 1986. There were so many protesters protesters trying to keep patients out from accessing the clinic that the city council created what they called a buffer zone ordinance. So 100 feet around that building, you could not trespass as a protester, and 8 feet around the body of someone moving in and out of that zone, you could only approach them if that person agreed to be spoken to. So this was one of the first examples where literal dimensions around bodies and buildings were created. It made its way all the way through the state court system and up to the Supreme Court in 2000, I think it's 2000 or 2001. The Supreme Court upheld the state ruling that yes, they can create these dimensions in order to ensure safety for those seeking access. So it's important to think about, who's defining dimensions that we have to then respond to as designers. There have been other cases that made their way to the Supreme Court that also include issues around no approach zones and even the amount of noises that are allowed around clinics and the sizes of the protests. They call images observable. There'd been in some cases in Florida, there have been such loud protesters that greater levels of sedation were required. So there's direct medical correlations with what is happening with some of the protests. And then the images would be so large that people actually could not move through the public realm. So those also had to be curtailed in their size and scale. So this begged the question for me as I was thinking about, okay, we've got these decisions that start to define restrictions or temporary kinds of spatial restrictions within the public realm. Are there others that we as a society have agreed to uphold? So one, most obvious, is when you go on election day, and there is a distance marker at every polling station in this country that says within 100 feet, you cannot have any political speech on the day of elections. That we agree, we do not want to unduly influence someone who's going to their polling station. So as a society, this is something we all agree to and uphold. And actually, I work as a poll worker now, so I get to actually pin this up and mark 100 feet out, and then you have another distance marker 100 feet away. Another space that's kind of ironic in some ways is around the Supreme Court building themselves. They've decided that if you want to protest, you have to actually be on the other side of every street that surrounds the Supreme Court. That the speech for them is also going to be restricted, and this is not a time and place. It's not certain times of the day or certain times of the year, but it's always this yellow line, this imaginary line is surrounding the Supreme Court, and you cannot trespass it if you're protesting. And the last one, the most recent one, was around gay military funerals in, let me see if 2012. So the Supreme Court, this case made its way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, yes, we are going to uphold the ability for people to protest around military funerals. It was really hate speech that was happening. So Obama signed into law in 2012 a requirement that 2 hours before and after a funeral, that you had to be 300 feet away from the location of the funeral to protest. So here's another example where time and place have been suspended in terms of free speech. So it's made me think about, well, why can't within certain moments and times around abortion clinics, when there's so many protests, why can't free speech be temporarily suspended? Because there are precedents for it. So I'm giving you bits and pieces of the kind of research I've done. So as I mentioned, I did travel around the country going to clinics and interviewing independent providers, so not Planned Parenthood, but others. And I had the good fortune, the honor, and the privilege to actually interview. Sorry, let me go back 1 second. The owner and the director and the medical staff of the clinic that used to be in Jackson, Mississippi. It's no longer there because they have no clinics anymore. But I want to start with a short clip to give you a sense of how protests were happening at this clinic, and pay attention to the fence.
Is lightning and light of the world.
It's quite difficult for a physician to live
here in the state, in the city,
The heavens declares righteousness.
and not be harassed.
It's just a scare tactic is all it is. It's not a scare tactic.
There's other options other than trying to take the life of this unborn child. Your parents.
So once again, this happened on a regular basis. And this was an excerpt from the last abortion clinic, which is a frontline expose on Mississippi from 2005. So as I was looking at Mississippi and Jackson, so here's another image where they will line up. And then in a similar vein, patients, so there is a parking lot kind of right around that, right through that fence, which is rather small. And most patients, once that is filled up, have to go down the street and actually park on a different street. And there's been, because it's so, the community is so against the clinic, there's been someone who's bought up all the houses on this street to make it illegal to park. So you can't park anywhere on the street. And so if you're coming for care, you would be walking all the way down, and protesters will be watching and get you as you exit your car and kind of surround you as you're trying to make your way into the clinic. And escorts have since started to, they were protecting them and carrying these boom boxes to try and block out sound. So I mean, it was really an unpleasant space to be in. The clinic overnight, she painted it pink because she wanted the community to know they, at the time, were not going anywhere. And you'll notice in that fence, there's now what looks like black plastic sheeting. So they're trying to figure out ways to just camouflage and make a bit more private that space behind where people would be walking. Not really aesthetically very pleasing, but you know, that was their ability or their attempt to make that a bit more secure. So I was interested in understanding, like, what are the other factors in states like Mississippi? So I did this for a number of states. So where's the clinic located? It was located in Jackson, but there's other clinics in neighboring states. How much would it cost if you didn't have a car? How long would it take you to take a bus? Because there are no trains, you have to take a bus. There's no really complete bus system. So it's a series of kind of, you'd have to make connections. And then looking at rates of poverty, the Guttmacher Institute has noted that most, not most, but a large percentage of women seeking care are mostly, they have children already, and they're often poor women of color. So Mississippi is an incredibly poor state, one of the poorest actually. And so these dark center circles are individual rates of poverty. And then the larger, a little bit lighter circles are female head of households with children under 5. So in Jackson, for example, the individual rate of poverty is about 40%, but female head of households, sorry, 23%, but female head of households is about 53%. So we're talking about enormous rates of poverty across the state, which make it even more difficult to pay for the procedure. And then, you know, Mississippi is a part of the Bible Belt. So I wanted to just see how many religiously affiliated institutions there are. There at the time were over, how many? It was like 8, I think there were like 80. Sorry, I just lost that number. Oh, 82, yeah, over 8,200 religiously affiliated institutions across the state. In Jackson, there's 450 alone. The governor has come out completely wanting to shut down access, the state government against access. So the separation of church and state is a bit murky at best in Mississippi. And then looking at, well, how can we think about expanding access? If hospitals become a space that are required to provide the full spectrum of medical care, it goes from 1 access point to 113. And then if we think about emergency contraception or Plan B, if myself and research assistants called all the pharmacies in these states. So in Mississippi, there were at the time 462 pharmacies. So we kept track of whether they stocked and sold emergency contraception. If we could determine the gender, we would note that. And we found that 66% of the male pharmacists and 55% of the female pharmacists would not stock or sell emergency contraception. And we got some really bizarre comments, like kind of off the cuff, like some of them said, no one working today will sell it, so you have to come back. We stock it, but we won't dispense it. Some gave actually erroneous information about how you would use it. So it was pretty alarming, the kind of degrees in which people are going to make access really challenging, if impossible, depending on where you live and how old you are. So another part to this research, which happened after this book was published, because I've given talks in many different, very diverse areas of disciplines and areas of the world. And I came across at a Rutgers Law Clinic, lawyers from Pennsylvania who were trying to argue in front of the courts why building code changes were not making sense and they shouldn't do it. But she said in this presentation, I can't understand building codes. I need help. And we couldn't find any feminists. She said this, I can't find any feminist architects to help me. So I immediately found and went up to her afterwards and it's like, I would love to help you. So to give you an example of what that looks like, and this is, for those of you who practice, this is incredibly banal and simple, but to think about people who don't have our expertise, to draw what these changes were that were being required from a medical facility to an ambulatory surgical center. So such things as changing widths of doors by 6 inches or hallways, well, by 4 feet, that's not insignificant, ceiling heights, or changing room arrangements and adding more storage, and even as drastic as, more robust HVAC systems, or needing sprinklers because of it being a surgical facility. So we created these diagrams so that lawyers could use them to argue in front of the courts why these changes were not improving the health or safety or life for these spaces. I mean, now this is, it's no longer needed, but this was something we could do using our expertise in a way that, I never would have imagined would be needed, but clearly was. So this, through our work, and then when Whole Women's Health was decided in 2016, they stipulated and said that these changes, these restrictions are making undue burdens for women trying to access abortion. So they became illegal. And then just to bring it more up to date, I don't know how many of you have been following, but during COVID, certain states had tried to make abortion, they claimed it was not medically necessary. So in the states listed, they were restricting access to abortion at certain points in time. This was called out by the UN that this is, a public health crisis for women in these states, that they can't access the full spectrum of reproductive health care. And that brings us to where we are today. And the Dobbs decision, which Shoshanna will speak about more from a legal perspective, but I wanted to just highlight that in the dissent by Justice Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan, they are very loudly saying how a woman now has no rights to speak of, and that forcing her to carry a pregnancy to term. And they raised several questions, which Shoshanna will go into in a moment. But one of the things they ask, which is still yet to be is unclear, is can a state bar a woman from traveling to another state to obtain an abortion? Can a state prohibit advertising out of state or helping a woman get out of state to providers? Can a state interfere with mailing of drugs or emergency contraception for medical abortion? So all these things we don't know, but they're speculating that that's going to be happening. And as a result of Dobbs, myself and Jordan Kravitz, who's an architect in Phoenix, wanted to do something. So this is where abortion is legal, fully legal, not partially legal or in the midterms may become illegal. This is now where abortion is legal. So we put out a call for anyone willing to, and some of you in this room actually have, you're on the list, to make a list of architects willing to provide design services for providers in states where it remains legal. So to date, it's I'm actually renews my faith in our discipline that 36 states are represented. We have over 200 people who've reached out to us. We have students who've been volunteering. We have contractors and those in the building trades who've reached out. And we're in the process of sending surveys to New Mexico, Colorado, California, and Oregon to create more robust lists, because these states have said publicly that they will be haven states. Eventually, we want to send it to all the states from the earlier map but this is, we're piecing together and creating the database that we then will send. So that's kind of where I am right now. And with that, I'll turn it over to Shoshanna.
Hi, I'm delighted to be here. I have to say, this is not my familiar space. So what is a legal scholar doing amidst a wonderful architectural center? So I just want to say that Lori and I met how many years ago?
Wow.
I don't know, a long time ago.
8 or 9.
Oh my God, it's way more than that, Lori. It was in Canada at a conference. In any event, so we just sort of became friends. And then I can't say I'm a wannabe architect, but I'm fascinated by design and regulation. And so we just have now collaborated in a very interdisciplinary way. So for example, there was, we just wrote an article that's coming out in a feminist legal journal that looked at the Garza versus Hargan. I may remember from the Trump era, and I know we were, well, I'm just making assumptions here, trying to erase that from our memories. But it was the case where they were denying abortion to undocumented, unaccompanied teens who were in the custody of the Office of Refugee, ORR. And under the aegis of this guy named Scott Lloyd, who was the director of it. And so there was a big legal challenge, and we wrote an article together. I looked at talking about the legal analysis, and Lori looking at, so they wouldn't let her leave to access abortion, and so what it meant to be spatially contained, and what that looked like from that kind of manipulation of the physical space. Anyway, so you probably couldn't see with my mask, I kind of chuckled when Lori said something about scale.
Yeah.
I don't understand it. And so I have a promise from Lori, because I've been reading feminist geography, which I understand is not architecture, but it is around the sort of the way spatial relations play out in a way that Lori's been talking about here. And there's stuff about scale and scale jumping, and I'm clueless. So anyway, but what I decided, that's a little background. So I actually had a different talk prepared for tonight that I've given before in other places, because I've been doing lots and lots of talking post the catastrophe of Dobbs. And so I had my PowerPoint, I had this all planned, and then I looked again and like, wow, it really has nothing to do with this, sort of the heading of this around designing politicized spaces. So I actually decided to not give that talk, so I don't have a beautiful PowerPoint. But because we're working together and we really are thinking in different ways, but actually about how Dobbs, and I'll talk about it in terms of the legal, but this idea of how it actually implicates sort of spatial relations and spatial boundaries in the decimation of Roe. So I apologize, I don't have slides, but I wanted to make this in a way, and I don't have quite the language of architecture, but to think about it in spatial ways, because actually that's one of the sort of what Lori has up here, that this idea of what it means to have states that there is no abortion access, off the map completely. And so where you live and borders have become much more important since the Dobbs decision. And so this idea of what it means to travel and what it means to potentially transgress borders in a way, which is how it's seen from the anti-abortion movement. So, and this is how we've been trying to sort of think about the relationship of law and architecture and the regulation of space. So bear with me, I may stumble a wee bit because I decided not to do something that felt more germane to this group. So I wanted to start with a quote from a feminist geographer, and it's this idea, it's not specific to Dobbs, it's actually talking more about like states where it's banned, like in Northern Ireland. but a political geography of abortion starts from the contention that abortion is a spatial phenomena. And if you think about what Lori just showed you about the control or the attempt of anti-abortion protesters to control the physical space of the sidewalk outside a clinic, and then through these trap laws, which is targeted restriction of abortion providers, to control the spatiality of access within clinics. And so I think that that's a really powerful way in this particular era to think about the relationship in a way of law and architecture, and how, I mean, it's very different, but how bodies are being controlled in space and where they can occupy safely access to reproductive health care, and where that's gone. So I'm going to sort of lay out a few more ideas around that, sort of abstract in that regard. And then I want to lay some of the legal foundation for you. And so I'm actually, I have notes, but I realized my glasses and my mask, it's a little foggy and I can't see too well. So I have it on my laptop, which is why I'm looking at it, because I've enlarged it to like 14 size print font. Also, I'm getting old, but that's another story. Okay, so with Dobbs, and again, I'm going to come back to it, but just to sort of lay out how space matters. One of the most contested and least certain issues is what is said here by the court. No one knows what the hell is happening in terms of whether, if your state bans abortion and has made it a crime, or you have one of these bounty hunter laws. I don't know if people are familiar, like Texas, which has said any private person can sue anyone, anywhere for aiding and abetting an abortion. So you, with no sort of boundary restrictions. So one of these most contested has to do with the crossing of state borders from an abortion ban state to obtain abortion in a state where it's legal. And what it means for people who are having the abortion, it means for people who are helping someone get to a state, including abortion funds who are involved in a big lawsuit in Texas, and for folks in liberal states like Massachusetts that have also opened our borders to people and said, you're welcome to come here. But what does it mean for those persons who are actually doing something that's legal here, but in relationship to someone who's crossed the border here in order to obtain something that is banned within the borders of their own state? So sort of this isn't about designing politicized spaces, but about the legal regulation of politicized spaces at the level, oh, is the scale of the state. I have to learn how to use that word, because it actually seems very helpful. So it's not a politicized space in terms of the clinic, but now whole states, the whole country is a politicized space. And so what does that mean? And I also want to say that it's not, and I'll say more about this in a minute, it's not like everyone had great access and then in June of this year, it disappeared, because as Lori's talk makes clear, there were geographical barriers, but it has a deeper meaning now because you have states that have completely banned abortion. So we're talking about kind of the legal regulation of the spatial relationship of pregnant bodies within these bounded politicized entities, which is the state. So sort of to what extent can a state reach across its own border? And I'll come back to this again. I just sort of want to highlight the themes. And no one knows, the folks who've written this article are the one sort of who just, they put out and they said, it's a brilliant article to have your article cited by the Supreme Court. I don't know what the comparability is in architecture, but it's like the height of, having made it as a legal scholar. But they're the ones that sort of say, no one knows what the hell is going to happen. So there aren't clear answers. I just want to say that. But what's known is it is the spatial relationship. So the question is, to what extent can a state reach across the borders to punish? And what about a state like Massachusetts that has said specifically, not just that abortion remains legal here, but has specifically said, come here, and has provided, and we can talk more because I know there's time for Q&A, what, if that's of interest, what that means, but has specifically said, we're going to protect anyone in Massachusetts who provides an abortion here to someone who comes from a state where it's a crime. So I want to talk a little bit now, lay some of the legal framework, but I just wanted you to have this idea in mind. And I have another quote again from a feminist geographer, and I think this is it's very powerful. So bodies are territories onto which states project power, but reproductive bodies crucially make territory in ways that conform to and resist dominant power structures. So sort of by making territory, meaning if you move from out of your state in order to access care, you are leaving behind the territory that effectively governs you to resist that power structure. So what I want to do now is actually talk about 3 Supreme Court cases fairly quickly, but in relationship to these ideas we're talking about. So when Roe versus Wade was decided in 1973, basically and it said that abortion is a right that is protected by the federal Constitution. There's more, more nuances and in it, but basically it is a federally protected right. Why that's so significant is it meant that it set a federal floor. Your basic fundamental right was the same whether you were in Florida or Massachusetts. So this idea of interstate or territorial tension and the meaning of sort of spatial boundaries and controlling sort of what your body was entitled to, it was the same. Now, it wasn't completely, because some states wouldn't set up clinics. It wasn't like you had to have a positive duty to provide access. So if you lived in a poor state, a state like Mississippi, I mean, Massachusetts, here in Boston, you hop on the Green Line, right? And you get to Alston. It's on public transportation. I was blown away. You're sliding out of California in 800 and something clinics. I mean, it's not like Florida or Texas or Idaho are going to have that many. But conceptually, at least, your right was the same no matter where you were, as a matter of law, as a matter of constitutional protection. So then there really wasn't a big deal about cross-border travel and sort of the spatial regulation, or sort of thinking about this body as a form of territory. So that was all well and good. Roe swept away all of the existing criminal laws, and until the Casey versus Planned Parenthood versus Casey, oh God, the decision is either 91 or 92. The case started in the Supreme Court 91. I think the decision, I should know this off the top of my head, but in any event. So in brief, and the part that I want to sort of tie in with what we're talking about, so between Roe and Casey, states tried to limit abortion rights, but for the most part, the court struck them all down. 2 exceptions, poor women and teens. So, surprise. So the right of a teen in terms of whether she had to involve her parents varied from state to state, but other than that, and then poor women, the court said, no, you don't have, Medicaid doesn't have to even though it funds everything related to pregnancy and childbirth, no, there's no formal entitlement to abortion access. So the reason they can't access is because they're poor, not because the state is funding a childbirth, but not abortion. So, and then Massachusetts, there were some liberal states that said, no, public funding, we're going to support, we're going to be, provide abortion support in the same way. So those were sort of the only real differences legally. Planned Parenthood versus Casey, say 91, 92. And what happened there is, again, states kept trying and trying to push, to contain Roe, and you had a more conservative Supreme Court then. But the court upheld a Roe to the extent of declaring abortion is still a federally protected fundamental right. And it talked about how the Supreme Court would have no credibility if it just overturned a decision because some of the justices are anti-abortion. Didn't quite put it that way, but that's basically what they said. And lo and behold, what we just had. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of the story. So on one hand, that's the same. You have this federal floor. So you have this right to abortion. No state could ban abortion under Casey. So that part of it kept the basic fundamental promise of Roe. But so the sort of, if you were abortion rights supporter, you would feel very happy at this juncture. If you were anti-abortion, you would be like, oh, shit, oops, sorry, I won't swear, it's being recorded. I'll be polite. So you would just be really sad. And you would say, oops, the Supreme Court forgot to overturn Roe, basically, or, and you would not be happy. But then there's a twist in the case. And this is where things begin to shift in terms of this sort of territoriality and a meaning of importance of geographical boundaries, which is what the Casey court said, though, is, but you know what? We think there is a greater interest in letting the states have more freedom. It was like a green light, more freedom to regulate abortion in order to persuade pregnant women that childbirth is a far better option, that states have this interest in sort of letting pregnant people know that there are great philosophical objections to abortion and they have the ability to promote childbirth over abortion, so long as, and Lori had mentioned this, with the trial plus, so long as the restriction doesn't impose an undue burden. Basically, so long as it doesn't, it's not an abortion ban. What that really meant then is conservative states were like, great, now we can enact these trap laws, 48-hour waiting periods, fake scripts that doctors have to read about abortion causes breast cancer and depression and suicidality. And so the differences between states begin to matter in a way that they hadn't before. So this idea of sort of this, again, going back to this quote that I started with, that the political geography starts from the contention that abortion is a spatial phenomena. It becomes much more of a spatial phenomena post-Casey, because in fact, Massachusetts had almost zero restrictions, some, whereas a conservative state could have, Lori has some of that in her mapping, could have multiple types of restrictions that not only force clinics to close because they just couldn't do those things that those beautiful diagrams were forcing them to do, but also if you live in a big state that's sort of hostile to abortion and a lot of the clinics have to close and you have to By a waiting period, it means you go to the clinic, they tell you about abortion, and then you go home and you're supposed to think about how awful it is to murder your baby. I mean, they don't put it that way, but that's really what it was. And then you have to come back. Fine, you hop on the green line, but the B line, here, if you live in Boston, the Boston area. In a big state, and you're a single parent, and you're on public assistance, or you're living with an abusive partner, all sorts of things, and you have to make 2 trips, and it could be hundreds of miles. These restrictions were very real. So I don't want to minimize them. And your access really did vary now, depending on where you live. However, and so that's very real and very important. And particularly access then for folks in more marginalized communities and had to jump through lots of barriers. But there was no question about that it was a crime to cross state lines, or that a doctor who performed an abortion in Massachusetts from someone with a state with a 48-hour waiting period could be facing criminal charges, because the underlying access still existed. Does that make sense? Okay. So this idea of this sort of confusion of this host of questions didn't exist. There's no question if you happen to live on near a border and one state required you to wait 48 hours and you could just cross into a state and it was 10 minutes away, the clinic, there's no question you could do it, because the bottom line was you still had the right to abortion. Dobbs shattered that. I mean, Dobbs completely shattered that, because what you have is now this radical reshaping. And if you think about Lori's map, the numbers vary, by the way, because lots of these laws are being litigated and laws are going into effect and then being enjoined by courts. It's around 14 states that have banned abortion, but tomorrow you could read in the paper that it's 12 because courts have enjoined. So there's some variability, but it's looking like possibly up to half the states ultimately will make abortion a crime. So that where you live and the geography and borders and the transgression of borders is sort of one of the central questions post-Dobbs. And so the question of whether you can control what happens outside your border, or whether a state, again, can expand in some ways its borders to protect folks who come here and protect providers, has become a really, really huge issue. So if state A criminalizes abortion, then any provider who were to perform an abortion in that state, there's no question, they've committed a crime. It's a felony. Within that state, you're subject to the laws of your state. But if someone who lives in state A travels to state B where abortion's legal, then what happens? By the way, the laws, and we can talk more in the Q&A, the laws around this, none of them criminalize the pregnant people who obtain abortions. So that's really, for now, that's really important to keep in mind. It's those who perform the abortion and then those who aid and abet people having abortions. Okay, I have a lot more, but I think I should stop for Q&A.
Sure, I mean, you can always, are there any?
Yeah, why don't I mean, well, let me just do this really quickly. I wanted to talk about medication abortion, and we can do that in the Q&A. The basic idea is states are controlled geographical entities. And so they can legally, it's a territory, and we live in a federalist system. And so it's almost like each state is its own country. And so normally then a state can't reach into another state. And that's sort of the axiomatic assumption. And that this idea of freedom to travel, which is not written into the Constitution, but has long been seen as an implied, very basic right, that you need, if a state can reach beyond its borders, then that has a chilling effect on interstate travel, freedom to sort of choose. Maybe you live in one state, but you want to marry your same-sex partner pre-Obergefell. I mean, a lot of these issues came around access to marriage as well. And so I just want to read you this quote. It's a little dramatic, but people who are arguing that states shouldn't be able to do this. And so federalism is how, you know, our country was set up, federal government, sort of over above as the supreme authority in certain areas, and then each state is its own, though, geographically bounded entity. That federalism does not entail a moral balkanization in which competing moral agendas seek to conquer foreign territories. Foreign here refers to another state. It should not be a system in which citizens, this is a very dramatic, carry home state law with them as they travel, like escaped prisoners dragging a ball and chain. So this idea is you should be free to make a choice to leave your state if it has enacted a law that you find morally reprehensible. However, and I think I'll say one thing and then I'm gonna end with this, there is a huge exception to that idea, which is that, so that would be for you to leave, or for someone, if a doctor faced criminal charges for performing an abortion, because then people wouldn't feel like they would be able to go to Massachusetts. So that's the general principle, but there is this kind of exception, which is that, let's say state A, well, we'll just use Texas and Massachusetts. So Texas has an abortion ban, is that if something happens out of state that has an adverse impact on the home state, on Texas, which if a state, which many are doing, define the fetus as a person and abortion as the killing of a citizen of that state, then a state may be able to reach beyond its borders because murder of its unborn citizens would flow back and have an adverse impact and be against the policy of an abortion ban state. Okay, I think I'll stop. I have things to say. Now it takes longer. I do have things to say about medication abortion, but I think we should open it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
For any questions.
Lindsay.
I have a question about what you were just speaking to. Normally a murder trial, wouldn't that be done in the state where if it was considered murder? Wouldn't that always be tried in the state where it happened?
Really good question. Oh, sorry. Yes, the question is, in a murder trial, wouldn't it always take place in the state where the murder happened? So one of the things that the authors of that article, yes, I mean, the question gets very technical. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the crazy.
Legal jurisdiction.
Exactly. It has to do with whether you have jurisdiction, whether a Texas court would have jurisdiction over a Massachusetts doctor, whether they could. So basically, I don't know the answer, but I have something to say.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what they're saying in that quote.
Yeah.
But Texas could also sort of bring the criminal charges in Texas and try to make the Massachusetts doctor come for having committed a crime against its unborn citizen. What a state like Massachusetts, I forget, you didn't use the word sanctuary. What did you use?
Haven.
Haven. So there's different words that are being used: abortion sanctuary, abortion haven, abortion shield law. And what Massachusetts has done is, so what could happen is there could actually be, let's say, a criminal trial and an indictment against a Massachusetts doctor in Texas. What Massachusetts, by saying it's a haven or sanctuary, and I actually like the word shield because sanctuary implies that you're completely safe and no one knows. So abortion shield law, what Massachusetts and I don't know, maybe like 6 other states have done is said, we are going to the extent we can, set up protections for anyone who is in Massachusetts, the same, by the way, who provides gender affirming healthcare. The law that's been passed in Massachusetts, and I don't think that's true for all the states, but if you provide legal reproductive health care, which means abortion and gender affirming care, and we have ordered, like law enforcement can't participate in any investigation against you. The court can't order you to produce documents, to answer to like interrogatories or discovery. Normally states are supposed to cooperate. There's this idea of comity, not comedy, comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, which is there's supposed to be interstate cooperation. And sort of this idea with these shield laws is, we're not going to cooperate. If you come against one of our providers or an aider and abetter, we're going to throw up as many barriers as we can to enforcing the law of another state. And the other thing was like, I'm sure you have malpractice, and I don't know what can jeopardize or your licensing for doctors. If you're sued for committing a crime, you could lose your registration, your malpractice insurance would go up, and that the law says, you can't board of registration, malpractice insurance can't take any adverse action. So that's what some of the sort of bluest states are doing. Does that answer?
Yeah. And is there any legal precedent that the states who are going to, like Texas, going to go after haven states or sanctuary states? Is there any legal precedent for them to have that much reach into other states that would allow them to argue for their ability to convict someone for murder in another state?
There is no clear answer. This is, one of the things sorry. Oops, I'll roll my chair. I'll roll my chair back. Sorry to the Zoom audience. So the question was about whether or not there's kind of any precedent for states having the power to sort of prosecute, to indict, to punish. There's very little law on this. And when Casey was decided, it was a 5-4 decision. So folks began to panic that Roe could be overturned. And so literally law professors began to write. This began to be this question. And there's literally like 30 well, academics can get very nasty, setting out these totally different views on whether or not what was possible. So it's kind of a big unknown. So no, there is very little law on this. There's some, and people read it differently. And you can go, I mean, we didn't stop between, so for either of us, both of us.
Yeah.
Oh, also for the Zoom audience, how are they submitting questions? They're going to type it? Okay. Oh, yeah. So you are welcome to also send us messages through Zoom. I mean, not messages, questions.
Yeah.
Anything anyone wants to talk about, to ask? That hopefully
I was kind of thinking about this in terms of time, and I think something that interests me that I was wondering if either or both of you could talk about is like, at what point is it too late to sue someone or to come after someone for this act? Like, how do we, in like a temporal space, like talk about, like, when are you like free from that? Or is that just constantly going to be something? Like, how do we, can you retroactively like sue someone for this, or like how do we think about it in terms of time?
Let me repeat. So the question has to do with sort of temporal space, which is another interesting way to think about space, and whether there are limits as to sort of, can someone be sued retroactively, or how long into the future can someone, is that my articulating? There are time limits. They're called statute of limitations. And so there are, but, so yes, I mean, there are, but, and I keep forgetting his name because I want to pretend he doesn't exist, which isn't very nice of me, but there is someone who has sort of set up this bounty hunter Texas law arrangement.
Yeah.
Do you remember his name, Lori?
No.
I
but
keep saying I'm
I
gonna-
can see his face, but I can't remember his
That's
name.
kind of scary, but.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he has actually written this major law review article that says that actually the Supreme Court doesn't have, only the legislature can repeal laws. So actually, even though Roe said these laws, let's see if I can articulate this, are unconstitutional, that the court really didn't have power to do that. So in fact, those laws, like in Texas, still actually existed, and people can be retroactively prosecuted. It's kind of a wacky legal theory, but so is his bounty hunter. He's the same guy, you know, and so his bounty hunter is catching on. I mean, Texas, Idaho, I think it's a state that begins with an A, which would be Alabama or Arkansas, or Alaska, but it's not Alaska. I think there's another state, 3 states that now have these bounty hunters.
But with the bounty hunter law, is there, and I don't remember this, is there a time component to it?
Oh, sorry, for those of you who are virtual, there seems to be a moving need where we're spatially reconfiguring.
But with the bounty hunter law, is there a spatial component to that? I mean, a time component, like I don't remember reading in that they had X amount of time to pursue it for the $10,000.
The $10,000 is part of the bounty
Yeah.
hunter, which
The
is
award.
the award.
Yeah. But is there a time component?
I don't think there is written. I'd have to look, you'd have to look at the
Yeah.
statute itself as to how long you would have. I don't know what it would be. Usually statute of limitations are fairly generous as to try to collect your bounty for suing someone. Oh, the other thing that Massachusetts has a sort of counter bounty hunter provision, which is incredibly brilliant, which is that they consider if someone tries to come at you from, you know, an abortion ban state, like a doctor or something, it's being called abusive litigation. And so there's a new cause of action in Massachusetts. You can sue them back and try to collect money from them as another sort of saying,
Yeah.
don't mess with us. And it's kind of reversing that. And I think other states have done that as well. So if they come after you, you can sue them for abusive litigation, because what you're doing is protected within this state.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
New Orleans.
oh,
Yeah. Oh, sure. So this person's writing from New Orleans, and the map is devastating and heartbreaking. Advocates say that folks from Louisiana will travel the farthest to nearby overrun clinics in Colorado or New Mexico, for instance. I'm deeply concerned about security at facilities. How can design bolster security as clinic owners look to relocate? And what of mobile clinics or offshore facilities? What design concerns, recommendations? Yeah, the security issues are real, and there's, you know, the kind of array that you would imagine with bulletproof glass and metal detectors. There's also the kind of defensive strategies that are used in like embassies and government buildings, and thinking about, I hate to even say this, like blast distances and ways that landscaping and berming can be used to create at least a bit more shelter from these kinds of things happening. And the issue, and clinics where I've interviewed, they're very aware of these concerns, and most of them now have metal detectors or some sort of body surveillance, and they won't let, you know, people other than those going through the procedure into the clinic at all, that you would have to wait in the parking lot or somewhere else. You are not allowed on the premises for issues of security. So it is really changing the care and the types of support that you could have with you on a procedure day. There are, I mean, the roaming clinics and the mobile clinics are something that's being discussed. And they're in plan, but I haven't seen any actually that have happened yet. They've been, you could go online and you can see that people are fundraising to create some. One of the things Shoshanna and I had worked on was this project. So because of this research, it sparred all these kinds of crazy ideas. And one of the things I had thought about years ago was what I had kind of, I called, okay, this name is not great, but it's called the sex bus. But it was
All she had to do was put in sex education bus.
I know, but that didn't sound as good. But thinking about using GIS, like data tracking, and where there's high rates of teen pregnancy, really poor sex education, that you would target these counties, and you could provide age appropriate education, you could provide contraception. So we brought this, Shoshanna encouraged me and was the kind of conduit to bring it to the law clinic at Northeastern. And I had no idea the legal quagmire this was going to create, because how you define public space, can you park there? There's minors, so you have to have parental rights or parental permission. There's size constraints around the types of the bus or van that you could use. And that's different from city to city and county to county. So what I thought of as this very, I mean, I just imagine it would be filled with like medical professionals, and we'd be handing out, you know, like condoms and tests, and it'd be just so easy. And you'd go to these places where we know there's a need, but it is so difficult legally to do those things. So although they're talking about these mobile clinics, it's not clear to me yet how those things can actually operate, especially if you're at a border state, and what are the legal restrictions in one state compared to right across the border for the other state. So it's far more difficult than I ever imagined. And the kind of offshore piece is also under consideration, but because there's no federal right anymore, I don't know what naval waters jurisdiction would actually apply, because I don't know if states have their own water distance. Like we had a federal one, so if you're 12 miles out is international waters, but we don't have a federal right anymore. So I don't know how the aquatic piece could actually work legally. I mean, because of distance and boundaries.
If you parked it at the 12-mile.
But then international of like, who does the boat belong to is the question. So that's where the legal would be of the boat's ownership. So when Women on Waves happens, it's under Dutch law. Abortion is legal under Dutch law. So if they're in international waters, Dutch law prevails. But in the case of states with no federal oversight now guaranteed, I don't know how that legal umbrella gets defined.
I'm picturing Castle Island and Carson Beach.
I don't know what
Maybe,
that is.
oh, that's where I just wrote
Sorry.
Sorry. So for Boston, it's,
Ah.
the harbor.
Oh.
I teach at UMass and I swim in Pleasure Bay, and that's a big part of my life. And I'm just picturing boats out there providing abortion services.
Ah.
But so go ahead, and then I want to jump in with
No,
a
go
little-
ahead,
oh,
please.
do you want to say anything about design concerns and recommendations, or?
Well, I mean, one of the concerns in these, I guess, I don't know, Haven states would be, the massive numbers that are going to be coming in. So one of the things we have been discussing is, well, how do you create more space? So is it, 24 hours, 7 days a week in terms of procedures? Is it more space and they expand? Are there new clinics altogether? So these are not, these are expensive questions to answer in terms of how more you can provide more care to millions of more people who are going to be moving across the country to access it.
And do you remember what the number is? Like, it's not going to be so much in Massachusetts because
But like California is 1.4 million additional people
Illinois.
coming in. And Illinois is another one.
Like every single state around it.
Yeah, if you look
Montana.
this, yeah. So you've got the whole kind of interior with no clinic.
So
Not
the-
even, well, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's not likely to be a big issue here, but
Right.
in those states, right? Are those the ones? Yeah, if you look at where there's
Like Illinois for sure.
New Mexico.
And New Mexico, yes. Yeah,
I mean, that's what this idea of becoming balkanized, right? And sort of that,
Yeah.
this sort of territoriality and boundaries and borders matter in just unfathomable ways.
Yep.
So let me jump in with saying about the mobile
Yeah.
clinics, and also you kind of answered it just about the offshore
Sure.
facilities. And maybe if people are interested, I can then segue into this idea of medication abortion, because I think with that question, I have another quote from the same feminist geographer, which is that sort of speak to that, the question, I guess, Amy asked, that about kind of coming up with mobile and offshore. I mean, those are forms of geographic resistance, right? And so here's this forms of resistance that create, this is not my brilliant, it's quote, I maybe brilliantly chose it, but I wish I could say I wrote it. Forms of resistance that creatively violate spatial boundaries may work to subvert the established structures of political power. This is in the abortion context, but they're inevitably contested. So in terms of the mobile clinics, my understanding is the idea is they're not going to go into states that have banned abortion. I mean, you're just outright then committing a felony,
Right.
and there's no protection for you. The fact that you come in from another state doesn't do a thing. You're committing, quote, murder in that state. So I think the idea is to park them on borders. So
Okay.
like Colorado, my geography is so bad. Here I am using all these fancy geographical words. I have no idea what's on either side, any of the three sides of Colorado. But it's like, what's there? Utah, okay. So, okay, thank you. So you would park it literally on the border, like literally like 1 foot over the border to provide access. And then you could do it on all three and whatever other states, so that's where the mobile clinics would go. There's another really great article in this feminist geography. I didn't know this, but crisis pregnancy centers, the fake clinics, they have mobile clinics all over.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and what makes it hard is then they disappear. Like, so there is something then, if anyone sort of tried to harass you, you just move for the day.
Yeah.
And then I think what Lori was saying, I think you're absolutely right, with the Rebecca bumpers and the women on waves of people, she flew under the Dutch flag.
Yep.
And so if it's 12 miles
yeah.
out, then it's international, and the flag on the ship governs what law.
Right.
Anything that happens is governed under Dutch law. And so here, if you fly a US flag, it doesn't help because now there's no US federal right.
Yep.
So great idea about subverting, but
Yeah.
I think, and I have no idea. I've not seen anything people write about whether, I don't think states have that power. Like if you flew whatever the Massachusetts flag is, and you went 13 miles out into the harbor, outside of P-Town, you know, whether it has any power.
Right.
I don't think so. I think
What
you're,
about NGOs, like Red Cross? Do they have any jurisdiction
I
in
don't,
international water?
oh, an I don't, I mean, well, maybe a Dutch ship could come here.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe a Dutch ship. I mean, we are, by the way, and then get back. I think there are 4 countries in the world that in the past 25 years, we are one of 4 now that has gone backwards in terms of abortion access and rights. One of 4.
Poland, Nicaragua, or no, I know Poland is one.
Yeah, Poland is definitely, which has been a big issue for Ukrainian women.
Yeah.
Who have border crossed into Poland. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, there are still lots of countries that have horrific laws, but the absolute global trend has been in favor of liberalization. And yeah, Poland, the US, and it would be on the Center for Reproductive Rights website. I can't remember the other 2. Sorry, that was a little bit of a diversion.
Oh, there's
another, okay.
Yeah.
Wait, I don't know if we missed a few.
I think this
Oh, okay.
Alicia first.
Okay. How do you prevent one state from prosecuting people that go to safe haven states? Then it seems to cancel out the safe state laws.
Okay, so what's that? I mean, I think your question, this is a question from Alicia. I think what you're getting at is why some people are now stressing, please don't use the word safe haven, because we can't make guarantees that if you come to Massachusetts, nothing bad will happen to anyone involved with your abortion. And so I'm actually using abortion shield states, like we're doing as much as we can to shield people from out-of-state prosecutions, but I don't think anyone can promise anything. I think that's what it is. And so it's trying to say that the idea is we will do everything in our power to protect you. But so for example, let's say a mass doctor performs an abortion on someone from Texas. And so Massachusetts has done all of these things to make it really, really hard. But here, to make it as hard as possible to get that doctor. And so in that way, we're shielding them to the extent possible. There are other shields as well. But if that doctor has family in Texas and goes there for vacation
They could be
to see
arrested.
their family, then you're safe in Massachusetts, which is why people are sort of trying to figure out the right word that's protective, but make sure people know that there's just all these risks that no one quite knows. And so the safe haven laws or the shield are trying to protect. This is post Dobbs, but there's no guarantee. I hope that answers So let's see, you had a question. Let's go to you
Yeah,
and
I
then
was-
back to
It
the,
totally touches with what Rachel is saying. I was wondering about like the whole like land back movement and how like native land plays into this question.
I'll let
because
you take
you
that.
want
one.
me to
Yes,
take this
We've-
one?
We've talked about this.
so messy. And
Okay, so 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 the indigenous land, does it affect the question about borders? It is extremely complicated. There's like a 60-page law review article that's coming out on this, written by native scholars. So, and it's very complicated, but there, and I don't even understand, not me, because I'm so smart, but I should understand all of this, but it's really, this stuff gets into this crazy, this is what people are fighting about now. I mean, it's in this crazy legal world,
Mhm.
but let me expand the question. The question is federal lands.
Right.
And whether like the federal government could, like whether clinics could open on federal law, on federal land. Sure, under Biden.
Yeah.
Right? But then they get closed down if a Republican, so you could, it's a great question. So there, and that's been another one of these things that is being talked about, but it's not a permanent solution. It would vary. And then the issue with indigenous communities is not only is sort of the status really uncertain as to the extent of their sovereign control of their lands, but it's also deeply conflictual, because suddenly people want to embrace indigenous communities and provide access for abortion for non-native people, when those communities have been so oppressed in terms of healthcare and access. So it's a very charged issue. So, but I mean, it is another place around borders and trying to find safe territories. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, there is an example back in 2006 where when the FDA, you may not.
Sorry, I don't mean to be rude. I'm immunocompromised. I have to be super careful. So I'm just stepping away.
When the FDA was contemplating whether they should make emergency contraception over the counter, and this was when Clinton was a senator of New York, because she brought a big stink to this, that they were, so it's easy to access in other countries. You don't, in Canada, for example, you don't need a prescription. And so there was a lot of commentary about whether it should be made over the counter accessible without a prescription, and for people under 18 years of age. So where's that cutoff? And so there, at that time, the Sagala clan mother had stated in public that she possibly would be willing to open a clinic on the Sioux Reservation as a way to create access. So this was coming from someone, an indigenous clan mother, who was saying this. It never happened, but there was this idea that if it was coming from their community, and it was a really kind of, it was a way to circumvent federal jurisdiction, because they have their own jurisdiction. But I think, to all the points Shoshanna makes, it's really problematic to think that somehow we could just take or engage indigenous land when it's not our land to engage with at all. So I think the one strength of the 2006 was that it was coming from their community as a way to provide care for their community members as well as a broader public. But it's not the same if we're thinking about it as people who don't have access and don't have ownership of those lands.
So I just, sorry, did you have another part to your question? Was it about
pretty much
that?
There is a.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of the design and the architecture of the building and spaces, are you finding that the design criteria pre-Roe v. Wade is carrying over to now, or is there like a new set of design criteria that needs to be evaluated and issued to architects and designers that are doing these mobile clinics and new clinics, and is the intent to distribute that to the list of designers and architects that you've worked with?
That's a great question. So the question was around design guidelines and whether there are new guidelines that need to be created and disseminated to provide care. So Jordan, my collaborator is a healthcare architect. She works at the Smith Group out of Phoenix, and this is one of her areas of expertise. And so one of another piece to this project is to create guidelines and recommendations that would be disseminated once we get through the survey phase. One thing we are finding right now, so we've been able to connect 4 providers with architects in various states, and one is her state is now illegal, so she's going to open a new clinic in another state, so that's a ground up project. And then the other ones were more about renovation and building upgrades needed, just not to increase access yet, but just to maintain the spaces that they have. But your question is a really important one, because with this uptick in demand, it's going to put a lot of pressure on the spaces that exist. And so that is kind of a little bit further down the line, something we want to do and be able to disseminate. So the long answer is yes, but we don't yet have that work in place.
So let me just, and then we'll go back and forth between the chat and live, just respond to them. Alicia, I think it was Alicia who had asked the original question. I can't see the top on the chat, but about, yeah, okay. So then and then can you scroll back down? Sorry. Okay. Claims a safe haven, but only if you're a resident. Really, I just wanted to clarify. So first of all, initially when I sort of got involved in thinking about this, and I was like, California and Connecticut kept using, we're a safe haven. And I'm like, well, why can't we use that word? That's such a powerful word. And then I was talking to some of the folks at the Civil Liberties Union who were really involved in drafting this. And they said, we're avoiding that, not just because we have a Republican governor who won't use it, but because it does create a sense of absolute protection. And I don't think in this uncertainty we can, but it's actually, just to clarify, it's not even positive certain that you can create it if you're a resident. I mean, it's not inconceivable that somehow a prosecution could take place, or a civil a bounty hunter gets a $10,000 judgment, and somehow they manage to enforce it against someone in Massachusetts. It's like we've erected, talk about sort of spatial. I mean, it is, we've erected kind of a fence around people here. But states are supposed to cooperate. It's violating sort of basic interstate norms around cooperation around legal proceedings. So it's not even positive that all of these will work. And remember, if this stuff gets up to the Supreme Court, who the hell knows whether they'll say these laws are impermissible infringements on the sovereignty of, no one really knows. So I just wanted to sort of add to that. But absolutely, if someone comes here and or if a doctor from here goes into, well, yeah, there's so many permutations, but if someone sort of like someone helps, they're a cousin, their friend, they're come from a banned state here, and they're probably protected here, but then if that person goes back to visit that person in the state, the judgment could be enforced, or that's what's up. That's as you move around, who you are and what you are potentially vulnerable to is going to shift. and no one really knows. Anyway, just wanted to sort of add that to the comment. So,
There were a few hands.
yeah, there,
Evelyn.
This might stir the conversation, but I'm interested if you know what are the similarities or differences about laws for people that choose to die medically if they're internally ill and ask a doctor for medication to terminate their life versus abortion. Yes, abortion is killing another human or a potential human versus yourself. Are there similarities to that? And how are states and federal governments dealing with that kind of aspect?
oh. I'm gonna go out on a limb here. You don't have a right to kill yourself in this country. I mean, we don't have a right. I mean, you can't be prosecuted because you'd be dead, but.
Well, Oregon does.
Oh, Oregon does, that's.
Oregon does.
Has, that's right.
Yeah, yes, it's that, yeah.
And it's like a doctor can prescribe it. but
In
they can't
Oregon,
deliver
that's
it.
right. And there are a few. So, sorry,
That's okay.
I was like, well, I don't know how I'm gonna answer this, so I just,
It's okay. like,
no, no. But say it again, it's an interesting, and then we also are supposed
Yeah.
to repeat it.
Well, because we're talking about murder and there are individuals that are internally ill or they're just can't handle the pain or whatever. And I know there are some cases that individuals ask a doctor for medical aid to help them. terminate their
Got
life.
it.
Yeah.
Okay,
So would that be something that's similar to the way we talk about abortion and laws and regulations about medical procedures that kind of terminate one's life?
I think that's so the question is, I sort of don't want to repeat it because I don't know the answer. But I will, because it's a great question. I mean, are there sort of similarities in how we think about the legal regulation of the right to die and asking doctors for assistance and sort of comparable? And I don't have an answer, and I think it's a really interesting question. But so if a doctor in Oregon, I forgot that, sort of sent the medication to someone in Massachusetts, the issue would be, I think, the same. I mean, that gets us into medication abortion, which is something I want to talk about.
But can I just, but that presupposes that a fetus is personhood,
Right.
and that is not legally defined as such currently.
Well, no, but lots
Well,
of,
you're using it as the battle, like you have
Right,
abortions, you're
that's-
killing a
that's what
person.
people-
Sure,
Yeah.
but the fetus does not have a legal right as a person yet.
well, but no, but a lot of these states,
Murder.
a lot of these abortion ban
They're
states
saying-
have actually now written into their laws fetal personhood. So in like Texas and Missouri, fetus,
Yeah.
which introduces another level. I mean, not that I want this, but it's a weird, if it is a person and it's killing a person,
Yeah.
then there's this push that the pregnant people should be held criminally responsible.
And that's also being discussed as well,
so,
but
but
it's not yet.
no state yet, as far as anything that we say could be like, we wake up tomorrow and it could be different. So just, but as far as I know, there is a group now that's really pushing, and there was an attempt in, not Missouri, yeah, it was Missouri, I think, a lawmaker to actually introduce to hold pregnant people also, that they, yeah. And and partly sort of gets us into, and it actually is reflects one of the posters you showed in the protesters in your first slide.
Mhm.
I think
Oh, yeah.
part of the reason why, because logically, it would make sense, right? I mean, if you have a fetal personhood and a doctor is, I mean, that's what the felony is. It's a felony in these states. I mean, it's not like a slap on the wrist or a fine. It's a felony. You go to jail. So if you have one of these fetal personhood, then why, I mean, you are then committing, you're engaged in the same criminal behavior. I mean, just setting us, but part of it is, I can't remember what in your protest, what the poster said, but basically, I think the explanation is women are seen, or pregnant people, it's very gendered, so it's women really in this, as victims of the abortion industry, that no woman would actually choose to murder her own. It's a whole, I know, it gets us in a slightly different direct, but I think that's sort of part of this fetal personhood and murder. It's that women regret their abortions. And that's been a big anti-abortion trope, that no right-minded woman would violate why God put us on this earth, which is to have babies. And so there is a very much that abortion has two victims. And so I think that's part of that. So I know, I apologize, it doesn't directly, but it's a fascinating question about what would happen if that doctor mailed,
Or you assisted someone from traveling from Nevada to Oregon.
exactly.
Yep.
Yep. I've not seen anything about that. And that's a really interesting question. I'll get back to you if I come up with anything, but
If we ever get into a conversation of medically assisted termination of your own life, that would be kind of interesting to see how the government would react to it as well.
It's currently legal in 11 states.
it's 11.
Oh, it is
sorry.
11.
In DC, I don't know. If
Oh,
it's in
wow.
DC, it's-
I didn't know
Okay.
it was that many.
Neither did I. It's
Yeah.
not an issue. Actually, I have to confess that clearly I have not followed very carefully, but it's an important one. And it's a really interesting to think about how, because it does potentially, or if someone goes to one of those states. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. My next law review article. Let's see. Like. what-
Oh, that unraveled, but thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, let's see, who here, yes.
I was more curious about if there's something that can be done to protect the identity, or like keep the people coming into these states and abortion clinics like anonymity, whether it be through design, like there's a lot of things we do in healthcare design that has to do with privacy, but in terms of protecting the identity through law or design, like is there something taken, recommendations?
I mean, one of the things we had talked about that we haven't, the question was around trying to protect a patient's identity, whether through the design or by law. So trying to remain as anonymous when you're
Or even the
seeking,
provider.
or the provider. So all of the above. One thing we had looked at, which we haven't worked on, was the issue of your digital footprint. So when you talk about anonymity, it's not just your physical body, it's your virtual body also, or your virtual identity. And that there's been a series of articles, both in the mainstream press as well as other locations, about how easily traceable and trackable you are because of your phones, and having people sitting in a Planned Parenthood being targeted anti-abortion
Geomarketing.
but the geomarketing that's happening as you're sitting in the clinic waiting. So it's a really important question to think about, especially because the digital track is also a way that can be linked to your traversing states and going from illegal to illegal to a legal state. So that becomes another way that you get monitored and surveilled. So it's really, there's so many layers of complexity to this. So it's not only about your kind of facial recognition or your body's moving physically through space, it's also how you're digitally moving through space and being tracked and traced all the time. So how do you start to create, and there are examples where they've got, I forget what they're called, to prevent that from happening in certain.
There are, I mean, this digital tracking, so you can just Google it now, and that's not saying but it's huge, and a lot of people assume that sort of HIPAA, the health portability, like privacy, that it protects sort of anything related to your health. It only has to do with doctors, and so that you Google medication abortion, And that's a
You're
certain,
a target now.
you're a target. I mean, and someone bought as part of like.
Oh,
trying-
yeah, right.
So there are data brokers, like this stuff, there's a whole
Of this
market. I
information.
mean, it's of this information. So there's a place called the Digital Defense Fund. I mean, this isn't like but it's another piece
Yeah.
of this. How did you put, I liked how, like your digital surveillance through space. I mean, huge issue. And so they were, it's a motherboard, they do like this progressive reporting, and they went to one of these data brokers and paid
Right.
like $167. And they got, it wasn't disaggregated by an individual, although there are ways to disaggregate. And they bought like, it was like a heat map that traced at a Planned Parenthood. And they just said they wanted it. They just bought it. That showed where people were coming from to go to this clinic and where they returned to. And it wasn't disaggregated by individual name, but it could show that doctors at a Planned Parenthood clinic on the border of Colorado were
Right.
performing abortions for you
Yeah.
folks coming from Utah. And there are, so there's that's a whole
nother-
huge layer in
And
this.
also, like period tracker apps.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
too.
Yeah, get rid of period tracker apps.
Yeah.
Although, there was everyone that was the immediate, like, everyone get rid of your period tracker apps. But it's some other people say, yes, important, but it gives also a sense of false security.
Right.
Because there are so many ways that someone actually did another thing, and I actually keep meaning to go back, where they just, not around abortion, but it made them think their own digital data and what was known. And so they went to one of these data brokers and bought their own digital footprint. If you do any online shopping, if you have any apps, there is a digital file on you, your age, your sexual orientation. I mean, if you go to a gay rights march, your buying preferences, it's all there and it's for sale. So it's another huge, huge.
I mean, in some ways, even more daunting than thinking about the physical response or like how to create anonymity and security as someone's coming in and off of a physical property. Like that seems easy compared to the digital aspects of this. It's so far reaching, and the scale of it is just enormous.
And so even if you think, well, I don't care, I'm in Massachusetts. Well, there are these bounty hunter states, and you're texting your best friend who lives in Texas, and you're like, well, come here. Oh, you don't have money for the plane fare? Let me help it. So, let me help you. And you have a digital record of aiding and abetting an abortion. It's really, I mean, I think that's right. It's really bone chilling.
Yeah.
Particularly as these state laws are trying to reach out across their border. And so, you potentially have committed an aiding and abetting civil defense that with minimum like damages that you might have to pay. I mean, this is an extreme, but it's real too. And so there are, if anyone wants me to send them I'm at UMass Boston, you have my name on you can email me and I can send you this digital stuff also is really chilling. And there are things about getting encrypted. What is it? Go duck or something?
Oh, yeah.
Duck. But there are all these ways, and leave your phone at home.
Yeah. Don't even bring
If you have to buy a second, like, flip phone or some, I mean, there's a lot of different strategies. Anyway, sorry.
But that was a segue into medical abortions.
Yeah, but I do
Okay.
want, yes, I would, if people are interested, just like to say something about medication abortion, but let's see, are there any more? Okay.
I have
Yeah.
one quick question. Are like the aiding part of things as architects, if we are in the
Yes.
not the banned state and we are designing a clinic
Great
in
question.
Illinois or California or whatever, are we also
Right.
criminals?
So the question is whether if you're an architect in a banned state and you're designing, providing design services in a state where it's legal, can you be criminalized? Is it a felony because you're aiding and abetting? That we don't know. I mean, it would follow the logic of what Shoshanna talked about, that we would be then, we would be held to a felony because we have assisted. So that, yes, that is a really good question.
But, I mean, that's the
And
world
what
we are
happens to your
now,
licensure and all of
Well,
those
but
things.
also,
which
like, when-
actually
What?
makes me think of a legal reform, which is that these protective laws need to include architects.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
don't think any of them do, right? I don't think, like Massachusetts,
Oh, yeah.
like if you, or, I mean, I don't think any of these states that protect people from, I don't think architects, neither are like attorneys who take teens to court to access abortion. But I never thought of architects. Also, just to be, the bounty hunter is civil. It's not a felony. It's a
Oh,
the
right.
aiding and abetting, although
Is
Texas
civil.
is now also saying they're now saying it's also a felony, but mostly the aiding and abetting are
The
civil, not felonies.
Okay.
And the statute of limitations for design. If
Right.
you designed a clinic and then it became
Yeah.
illegal later.
See why
or
we work together?
Yeah.
I mean,
But
here's
that's,
a-
yeah, that's
it's
a
a
really
really
great question too.
fast-
Previously designed a clinic and it came into effect, like, where does the limitations come in?
Because apparently, I mean, when you stamp drawings, you need insurance for the rest of your life because you
Yes.
could be held liable whenever.
I am gonna propose this
Yeah.
to
Can
the.
we do this, Rosie? Because we don't know how to.
And also, what about the contractors? What about
Yeah.
the people? working
Yeah,
on
so,
sites?
yeah.
Interesting.
Physical
And you
buildings.
spend medical suppliers, like someone
How far
that
back
brings
are they
materials there.
Right, yeah.
I mean, there's a bunch of, won't use the word, I'll be polite, but there's the Texas Freedom Caucus. And they're like 8 lawmakers, I mean, elected officials who, like, there are like, for example, if you live in a banned state, there are employers who are saying, if you have to go out of state, we will reimburse the cost
Yeah.
as part of your employee, like your benefits packet. And so there's this letter that these 8 lawmakers in Texas wrote to a law firm and said, you are supporting the murder of our unborn children. And they filed, they're saying, there's a whole bunch of litigation now against these law firms and this, against this law firm and against abortion funds by these kind of really right-wing, not nice people. But they're going after like this employer, this law firm who said they would pay. And they're saying you have to keep all your records, and they filed like discovery to get all this
Oh, wow.
information. So I think thinking about this, we should, but it's
Yeah.
from a role of architects. I just want to say just very, very, very quickly, and we have 2 minutes, although we can stay, but is also one of the big issues around going back to this forms of resistance that creatively violate spatial boundaries is this issue of, can you get abortion pills, medication abortion
Yeah.
into states where it's a ban? Because if abortion is a crime in a state, it doesn't matter whether it's a clinical abortion or medication abortion. But there are ways of subverting state boundaries. And one of them, for example, is doing telehealth. And I'll just give one example, but this is you do a telehealth appointment with like where would you, all right, Utah.
Yeah.
And
Live
you
in
do
Utah and you telehealth with someone in New Mexico.
in New Mexico, where it's legal. But they can't send you the pills to your home address. So there are now virtual mailboxes. And it gets sent to a virtual mailbox with mail forwarding, and it's the virtual mailbox rather than the doctor in New Mexico who is sending the pills. So there are, if you're interested in that, look up planc.org. It's an amazing resource, but it's around subverting these spatial boundaries, which is easier to do with pills than physical, like untethering abortion from physical places like clinics. So that in a nutshell, but that's sort of one of the big issues that people are looking into around doing that. And saying the woman who set up the Doctor of Women on is it Women on Waves?
Yeah.
Aid access, and you can, she's in the UK now, and she has access, she sends pills through a pharmacy in India. I mean, it's another level of subverting these rules. So just wanted to throw that into the mix. Digital footprint issues, but we'll come back.
One last thing, I've started, there's some women's organizations in New York and we hope to expand, but we've been talking about ways, like how do we respond as a discipline to the post-Roe landscape? And one of the things we've been talking about is how can we think about material procurement and ways that we source materials? Are there ways that we can put economic pressure on states that where it's illegal, so we may not source materials from these states? So it's a conversation that's just started, but thinking about, could there be economic consequences or suggestions? It's not that, you know, that we would have a kind of statement and start to think about where and how we, as practitioners, you find your materials for projects so that there actually becomes a financial impact to these states potentially in a more significant way. Because how, you know, it's one thing to sign a pledge, it's another thing to actually have a financial hit. Similar to when Black Lives Matter was happening and certain sporting events decided to cancel in states, like that got some attention. So we were trying to think about parallel measures from our industry that could also have financial implications. So those discussions have started with kind of firm heads and more progressive firms in New York City and their organizations.
Well, someone could bring that conversation to Boston.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, this was great. Thank you so much for all your questions.
Yeah, really good.
Thank you online.
Thank you, great, for your questions and comments.
Yeah. And Amy, if you're still here, nice to have you here. I met her a long time ago. She's in New Orleans.
Yeah, and you know lots of people. I don't know any of you, but it's lovely to be here. And if you have, I'm at UMass Boston, so it's umb.edu. If anyone has a follow-up question, feel free to be in touch. Happy to answer questions or send you scary stuff.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
I'll let you.
Thank you. It's very, really, I mean, one of the things that the Dobbs court said is, oh, you know, Roe created all this horrible like conflict and pitting people against each other. So we're just gonna get rid of it and calm everything down. And it's like, are you kidding? Now we have literally wars between states.
Yeah.
You know, that's what in that article that was cited. I mean, that's what they're saying. Like, what a crazy perspective to have, because the uncertainty and the tension is just, yeah, it's heightened, and the danger and the politicization of space, you know, on all scalar levels.